My name is Nick Rennie. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, and I'm here to simply perform the introduction of our speaker today, Nadarajan. He has been lured away from his most recent work in Maryland as of last year to come here to be the Dean of the School of Art and Design. His various credentials include places like Singapore, his native state, Penn State, Japan, the University of Warwick in the UK. He has written works that have been translated into a dozen languages. I'm not going to list them all. It's impressive stuff that relates to the intersection between art, design, and the sciences. He's a co-principal in a National Science Foundation project relating to exactly that process of creating a network for collaboration among people in those three fields. And he's going to talk to us today about Southeast Asian art, contemporary art. So welcome, Dr. Nadarajan.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for coming, and thank you, Nick, for the introduction. What I wanted to do, well, yep. So we just, so what I thought I'll try and do is just to start by saying, first of all, it's extremely exciting to be part of the University of Michigan and be affiliated as a faculty affiliate to the Center for Southeast Asian Studies. While I was in Singapore, I've looked to Michigan as one of the places where great work in Southeast Asian studies was happening, and it's especially nice to be here presenting a paper about Southeast Asia in a center that I've really looked up to. So one other thing that I thought would be useful to contextualize what I'm saying is that, as all of you know, Southeast Asia is not a single thing. And so any kind of introduction or discussion that will frame it as, well, we are going to talk about Southeast Asia is going to be pretty problematic. So I'll start with telling you that that's not the intention of this talk. I said Southeast Asia primarily because I'm picking a number of countries that I have personally worked in and I've done projects in, and I am deeply familiar with the artists and the practices that they are engaged in. So this is really an attempt to try and provide you with a personal perspective and a professional perspective as a curator, having worked and written about artists in this field, working in different parts of Southeast Asia, and having tracked what they are doing and still keeping track of what they are doing over the years, at least for the last 2 decades. So I'll start then. So contemporary media arts in Southeast Asia. So I'll start with talking about what are media arts. It's useful, I felt useful for us to talk about what media arts are, simply because it is not, especially for people not in the arts, this is not a familiar term. And even more complicated is the fact that there are some assumptions about what media arts are that actually is being problematized by the kinds of works that I will show today, and the kinds of works that are continuing to happen in Southeast Asia and many parts of Asia that I think you need to know about when you're thinking about media arts as such. It's commonly discussed. Media arts are commonly talked about as art forms that are in some way using computational technologies. Technologies that have fundamentally computational capacities. The problem, though, with that kind of definition, when you frame it in a region like Southeast Asia, or in art practices that are happening in Southeast Asia, is the concept of what is media and what is technology and what are these things in terms of access and availability and use is very different. And so that needs to be framed back into the concept of media arts for us to really, truly appreciate what is going on in the field of media arts as well as what's going on in Southeast Asia. What I would like to do is to, as a kind of a minimal condition, talk about media arts, especially for the purposes of today's talk, as art forms that employ a variety of programmable technologies in media. So meaning that it is not just media that is presented as such, but has capacities for you to program it to do particular things. Do particular things at particular times, do particular things with particular people, and have a kind of an interesting feedback that is happening by way of programming it to do so. So that's the more minimum kind of nominal definition of media arts that I would like to work with. And these include artists working with robotics, working with virtual reality, working with, interestingly, even biotechnologies, because the biological today needs to be thought about in terms of manipulable and programmable units, primarily because we are talking about genetics and proteomics, where at the minute level you are able to still manipulate and reconstruct and program them differently. So there are artists who are working in all these different areas across the world. What is different about Southeast Asia was a question that I had during the time I was living in Singapore and working as a curator there. And I quickly realized that what was interesting about Southeast Asian artists and their responses to these kinds of technologies was that there was a kind of healthy skepticism about these technologies and what they provide. Sometimes there was even a kind of, well, we don't have it, so it doesn't matter. We will try and make do with whatever else we can use. So there was this high-tech, low-tech kind of discussion that happened for a while also. So some of these things I will highlight as we move forward. But okay, so I also thought it'll be useful to talk about what is the context within which media arts developed in Southeast Asia. Now, this is not an attempt to try and provide a historical trajectory. Each of these countries and sometimes each of the artists and the way they have developed requires, and warrants entire studies. But I wanted to point out to you certain things that are peculiar to media arts that are not found necessarily in our understanding of the context for other kinds of cultural production, whether it's the fine arts or design. So one important thing in media arts, especially because technology is so fundamental to it, is the technological lag between, and this is not, the lag has two dimensions. One is the lag between when a particular technology is available, meaning it's been discovered or developed, and when it actually becomes available to artists to use. And then when there is another dimension in Southeast Asia, because the length of time, the lag between when it's developed and when they actually get to use it is even further, right? It's even longer. And part of it has got to do with simply issues of budgets with which the artists are operating, the kinds of technological facilities and support systems that can support the kinds of technology. Even if they brought the technology in, it might not be supportable because there are not the kinds of electric grids, the kinds of support mechanisms that would allow these technologies to function. So there is a kind of a twice lag sort of happening in Southeast Asia that I was very keenly aware about when I started traveling in Southeast Asia and looking at artists working in the field. Now, another dimension about this is that there is a narrative of development, of social, cultural, economic development that media arts really gets played into, which is both problematic for the cultural producers, but extremely beneficial for them if they are willing to manipulate themselves and play the line of the governmental initiative. For example, In some countries in Southeast Asia, there was a systematic effort to invest in what they called IT technology, information and communication technologies, and the idea of cyber infrastructure. So Malaysia and Singapore were way ahead in the early 90s. They started putting some serious money towards it. By the mid 90s, they had a lot of funding that was being funneled into information technology infrastructure. And inevitably, this led to opportunities for certain kinds of cultural producers, artistic practitioners, design practitioners, to actually find support for the kinds of things they were doing. For example, in Malaysia, they started investing significantly in what they call the Cyber Jaya and the cyber infrastructure pretty early in the 90s, and they ramped it up pretty much. And it is very much, and Linda knows this much better than I, but this dipped very much in after 2000, after the financial crisis in 97. But governmental drive to look at creative uses of new technologies was an important driver of artistic development, especially in media arts. So this was very peculiar to, I mean, you will see some of the developments, but it's, I think, most evident in Singapore and in Malaysia. Not so much in the early phase in Thailand, but increasingly so in Thailand today. But it's useful to know. The contemporary art scene is another important context. So what were the kinds of issues that artists were thinking about dealing with within those countries? That was critical to how these technologies were being used. So if the contemporary art scene was very formally interested in, painting and sculptures and abstraction, like it was in the Vietnamese art scene for a very, very long time and still is, many of these kinds of practices have never really taken serious root. In places like Indonesia, where there was a huge amount of interest, especially in the early 90s, towards political agitation, and many of these works were mobilized towards, looking at, because the art environment is already agitating in a way that was using art and culture as a way of changing the discussion. A lot of the artistic practices in media were being affected by this. Geopolitical affiliations, and I cannot overstate this, but it's really peculiar. You will see that, I mean, there are some interesting connections between, for example, Indonesian media arts development was heavily funded by Dutch foundations and the Dutch government sometimes. And a lot of it was driven by the fact that the Dutch were already moving very, very much ahead in the area of media arts and the use of new technologies. And that's important to know, that some of the post-colonial relationships were still carrying on, but under the guise of, well, this is cultural upliftment, this is changing the discourse and helping Indonesians embrace new technologies. And you will find some of that also in the developments in Malaysia and Singapore in relation to British and Australian media arts developments. They were very tightly connected. There were lots of interchange and exchange between artists in these countries and Singapore and Malaysian artists. In fact, some of the Australian and British artists were actually teaching in some of these institutions, and they were important key practitioners of this. So some of these political affiliations and were impacting the kinds of art forms that were developing. And finally, I think an important ground for a lot of these practices is, what is the community looking for in the arts? And what is the community receiving? And what is the community receptive to? There are some really interesting things that developed in Indonesia that would probably never develop in Singapore, simply because there was a strong community ethic about art making and cultural practice in Indonesia that never really developed in Singapore. So so you need to look at some of the works in relation to that, and I'll highlight them whenever possible. I am looking at the time. That's good. So I wanted to highlight this particular effort as a kind of indication of this early appropriation of the ASEAN language towards furthering international or inter-regional cooperation between artists working in media arts. This started in the late 90s, and it was based in Malaysia. It was started by two artists, Niranjan Raja and Hasnul Saidon from Malaysia. They were working at the University of Malaya, Sarawak, and they were, interestingly, some of the pioneers, so to speak, of internet-based art forms. They were actively encouraging it. They were actively calling on artists from the region to actually submit their works for addition to the eArt ASEAN Online. Right now, this does not exist as such anymore. It only exists in the art archive that is housed in Hong Kong. So that's the only place you can see some of the things that they have housed. But it's an early articulation of a kind of a regional identity of sorts. Some of the works that were represented here were already indicating a sort of homogenization of sorts, where the ASEAN logic was sometimes overwhelming. At least some of us in the arts felt it was somewhat overwhelming, in the sense that the same kinds of issues were being highlighted because this platform encouraged that kind of showing. While I am sad that it actually disappeared about 4 or 5 years after it started, it actually was an important resource, but it also was an important kind of obstacle of sorts, because it created a particular framework where most who were making in this field were gravitating towards it, and because this was the only real platform, they often had to frame their discussions, their ideas in relation to it. So that's useful to note. So instead of trying to do a country-by-country presentation, and each of these countries are complex onto their own, and all of you are familiar with the complexities involved, what I thought I'll do is just highlight 3 important thrusts of media art practices that I thought would be useful for you to keep in mind and think about as you're looking at the works. So, old and new media. So and this is not peculiar to Southeast Asia. This is peculiar to all art forms. All art forms constantly struggle with how do you deal with the new. When you have a new material, new technology, how do you deal with it? In 1839, when they introduced photography, right, it put painting on alert. And people were wondering, will painting survive? It survives and it thrives. But technologically, that new technology was forcing the existing technology, the old media, to reevaluate what it was about. So this is a work by Krishnamurti, a work called Wayang Machine. Krishnamurti has been working in video art for very, very long. Since the early 90s, he has been working in video and performance. This work is interesting primarily because Krishnamurti is drawing on the relationship between a traditional media, the wayang, the wayang theater, and using that as a platform to think about a new media like video. So there are the same principles of projection as opposed to the back projection. This is a front projection. He's thinking about what is the symbolism that is involved in the traditional media wayang and what is involved in video. So it's a very meditative piece that actually looks at the continuing tensions between a media that or a particular practice that is under threat, so to speak, by a new media that is become more popular but not necessarily radically different. So he's trying to show the connections as well as the disjunctions between these media. This is a work by Jompet and Wenza. Both of them are Yogyakarta-based artists. Krishnamurti is also Yogyakarta-based artist. Again, that's another interesting thing. Most of the interesting developments in media arts happened in Jogja and in Bandung, not in Jakarta. And I think it's got to do with the fact that the fringe actually afforded them a lot more opportunities to develop interestingly. And in Bandung, it had to do with the fact that the BIT, the Bandung Institute of Technology, was one of the first places that had some serious coding and programmers who were working in the field. They started over there. So there was an interesting technical background that actually drove developments in media practices there. So this is actually, as you can see, it's a rigged up installation where bicycles are generating a series of images which are basically animated and video images. And so it's performed. It's a very major performance, and they are basically cycling vigorously, and their cycling is actually sending cues to the image that you see here. So it's the person is running faster. There are different kinds of images that are appearing there. So again, they were looking to, and this is very peculiar also to Jogja and the artistic developments in media arts there. There's a very kind of arte povera kind of methodology, which is use whatever you have. So you will, if you go to Jompet studio or Wenza studio, it looks like a scrapyard. They go out there and pick up everything, all kinds of things, including computer parts, and then they rig it up again, and they rework it, and they make it work to do interesting things. So and this is a project that was done with very minimal technology, but it's highly engaging, and it's got all the elements of interactivity and feedback that are associated with very highly technologized media artworks. This is remember I was telling you about how he creates this composite electronic from composite electronic bits that that is scavenged from all over. He creates these musical instruments that are played with electric resistance of his own body. So his body is moving in relation to, so his body is generating the electricity, and he is actually working against the electricity of the installations he works with. So these are very heavily electroacoustic music scene, especially in Jogja. The media art scene was very tied to electroacoustic music scene and the performance art scene. This is Harry Donna, one of my favorite artists in the world. He's a fascinating artist. Harry has been a strong critic of the Suharto government for a long time, and he makes stunning paintings. I mean, he worked in every media possible, and he made these huge, large paintings that were looking at making fun of politicians and political theater that was constantly going on in Suharto, the Suharto regime. And he made a whole series of automated sculptures, where these are all automated sculptures that are basically wind-up things, but they are wound up with a very specific timing that is associated with each one of them. So it's really souped up to just do very simple things, but it actually creates a compelling theater that ridicules the political environment that he was working in. This is Fermentation of Mind, 94. Note the dates. He was talking about this. So what happens is that this is a cast of a clay cast of his face, and his head is constantly nodding. in relation to some political rhetoric that is going on in the background. This is Angels Caught in a Trap, where again he's using some simple wind-up devices and creating a highly choreographed presentation where these angels are vigorously flapping their wings and caught in these nets. This is I think one of his most ambitious work. It's called Gamelan of Naaman, because the Japanese word for drink and communication supposedly rhymes the same, and so he wanted to talk about that. So this is basically appropriating gamelan instruments, but using simple solenoid beaters. These are solenoid beaters that are basically just randomly. They are all timed to do different things at different times. So it creates a kind of a sound insulation. This is Jompet's work, Java Machine. It's a really ambitious project. It was shown in Singapore during the Singapore Biennial. It's an amazing work because it is a critique of the post-colonial relationship between Indonesia and Holland. It talks about the construction of Java as a sugar-based economy. He had a performer who went to an old sugar factory which had been abandoned, like many of our auto factories here, and he created this amazing installation and performance where in early sugar factories, it seems there was a spiritual guide who came in and did rituals to make sure that the machines are going to work well. And so he basically had someone learn that all over again and actually perform it. So there's a video and an installation of Dutch paraphernalia and early Indonesian paraphernalia, just to show the kind of contestation of cultures. This is with Pim Kanchanapong from Thailand. An amazing artist. So he created for the Singapore Museum the world's slowest SMS billboard. And basically, what happens is that you can send an SMS to a particular number, and as soon as you send that SMS, behind every one of these letters there is a person who will actually slowly take the right letter and then put it up. And then, so he was basically talking about the relationship between the speed of transmitting information and the speed at which it is delivered to you, and talking about the slowness and the speed in some ways. This is this is called Fruits. He basically used an early system of paper folding, which he digitized. He created digitized versions of all the fruits, right, and how they will be folded, and then these were then folded into fruits. And he was looking at the whole relationship between the fabrication of fruits, the digital fabrication that is available today, and he's been doing a lot of these kinds of projects so this is one of his larger installations. As you can see, it's installed in a shopping mall. I'll just show you a quick video just to. So this is made up of very simple, it's all made with wood. It's made up of very simple mechanical devices that each one of them, it's a simple winder, that each one of them is actually programmed to turn at a particular point. So there's a back-end program that actually runs this whole thing, but it's a very elegant use of very simple technology to achieve amazing results. So, let me get out of here, then go back onto this one. So, this is a work by Tsunami.net, which is a group of two artists, Charles Lim and Woon Tian Wei, from Singapore. I worked personally with these guys for this project. They were interested in the real distances between the real distances and the real geographies that are implied in net communication. So what they did was they created a number of projects where they walked from, they sent messages, they started doing walks, pilgrimages, basically, from where their computers were, where their computers were, to where the servers for those computer link it. So if they have a URL and they'll say, look, right now I am going to this URL, so this particular site. So the URL is physically located, the server is physically located in this case, it was located in Johor. So they basically walked to that place in order to access what was going on in that on the site. So the idea really, again, you can see there's a continuing challenge to the question of what is the relationship between real things, real spaces, real people, and virtual environments, virtual actions. And I think that kind of healthy skepticism about technology is very alive in media arts in Southeast Asia, and I think that's one of the things that makes it interesting and exciting. So another theme that I thought would be useful for you to keep in mind is the use of religion, the drawing on religion and on folklore as a way of making sense of media art experiences and media art works. So this is a work from '98 by Nadarajan Raja, the Malaysian artist I was talking to you about. He did a project on virtual puja, which is a ritual a domestic ritual that you engage in to a particular deity. So he, interestingly, was a pioneer of a lot of these ideas because he was interested in, so how can we think about the virtual relationship, right, between people, and then frame that in relation to God, So he developed a website where people could actually come in and do a puja for a particular deity of their choosing. Now, interestingly, there are virtual puja sites now. I think since 2006 there have been virtual puja sites that are available for people, and so people are taking that seriously, meaning that they've actually leaped over. So this was done ironically. In 2006, already now people are already conducting virtual pujas where they have acknowledged that the relationship to the deity is a virtual one anyway. So why do we need to go to the physical space? So it's fascinating how that has changed, and this is not just in Hindu rituals. There are a lot of interesting digital solutions for religious rituals. So there's a digital rosary, there is a digital confession app. If you are interested in more privacy than going to the church. This is Jimokut. Jimokut is a Tagalog word for soul, and basically it was an online project where people were asked to submit. So this is based on a kind of a folklore where it is said that the soul is active throughout the day, throughout the night, but when the sun is coming up, basically what the soul does is just goes into wraps itself into a leaf, and then stays there until night starts again. So this was an attempt to create an online collaborative project where multiple people were encouraged to submit their notion of a soul, and then that was actually wrapped into these digital leaves and then kept as a repository of sorts, each night to be opened up again. This is Fatma La Salle who was an important and who still remains an important influence on digital media arts in Philippines. This is a project that was looking at mapping the volcanic activity around Philippines, and she was interested in framing it in relation to not just, well, this is a simple exercise in volcanology and measurement, but she tried to think about it in terms of framing it in relation to ritualized notions of what these volcanoes are, where they are known to be located, even though they are physically located in other places. This is a work by Sooty Vichayanand. So Sooty has been working for a long time looking at the relationship between oneself and one's rebirth, and so he's a practicing Buddhist. He's actively explores that in his own work, and this is an installation where these floating statues of himself are actually being presented, and he's using this to talk about potential for renewal, potential for rebirth. Urban and community engagement. It's another aspect I think that is worthy of keeping in mind, meaning that media artists in Southeast Asia are very concerned, and most of them arise in highly urban environments. I do not know of many rural-based media artists, and some of it might just got to do with technological access, but I think it's got a lot to do with the fact that the urban environment provides a lot of the triggers for the kind of work that happens here. But there's also a kind of a strong commitment to community engagement, meaning that media artists in Southeast Asia, a lot of them, are committed to transforming society using those technologies in whatever way or form to support community initiatives, transformation of people's lives. This is Common Room in Bandung. It's a small little art space. It's basically run out of someone's house, right? And it's very typical. This is not just typical of media art spaces, but it's typical of art spaces all across Southeast Asia. They are typically small little someone's house that has been just converted into, the back is converted into an art space. Performance happen there. People have exhibitions there. Green Papaya in Manila is an interesting example. Common Room is a good example in Bandung. House of Natural Fiber, which I'll show in a short while, in Jogja is another example. So these are not exceptions. This is the rule, that you actually create spaces that are right smack in the community, highly residential areas. People come there as a kind of like, well, where do we go this evening? Oh yeah, we go to Common Room. They're doing a show. The cafe will serve some nice coffee and drinks and whatever. So it becomes part of the larger. And as you can see from the number of motorbikes, it's a place to hang out. And so that's what happens. Each evening they host events. People come together. They do a lot of projects. They do a lot of after-school programs with kids, giving them access to new technologies, training them in animation software that they will start talking about their own narratives and find ways to do that with technologies that they are comfortable with. This is a project that they did, which was like a kind of a connection between Bandung and Helsinki. This was done as part of a larger festival that happened in Helsinki. It's basically called 36 Frames. Each, they gave away hundreds of small cameras to people, to young kids, to go out there and take experiences of their own cities. And then these were all uploaded onto a site. And this was then exchanged with same number of kids in Helsinki who also did similar things, and so the kind of exchanges and the similarities of experiences as well as the differences were were being shown through the site. This is House of Natural Fiber. See some similarities between this and the common room? Well, here there are not as many motorbikes, but believe me, it does get very crowded each time. And so again, typically, this is so these are the kinds of workshops they run. So this is a simple workshop on kids using doing some basic physical computing, learning how to solder, learning how to build simple circuit boards, learning how to make things talk to each other, connect to each other. These are important skills, like it or not. These are going to be critical skills for all of us. I mean, for all our next generation, because these are the kinds of things you make things with, because most things are going to have a certain level of programmability built into them. And so that next generation needs to understand that as part of its own creative making. This is Holy Shit, which is, and it's tongue-in-cheek, but it's also their attempt to try and think about environmental pollution, so ecological, how to build an awareness about ecology. So basically, this is a large installation that they created for one of their major shows, the House of Natural Fiber, in 2012, and it's basically 8 separate tanks, tanks with plants, and some tanks with lobsters in them. So I'll show you this. So tanks with lobsters and tanks with plants. And what they created was a kind of an ecosystem of sorts where the primary thing that was being transmitted and circulated was basically shit. That was, it was just the feces of the lobster was being converted, was being captured by cameras and being presented elsewhere in screens, but they were also harvesting it and converting it into carbon dioxide for the plants. So it's a fascinating project that is basically trying to show the ecological cycle by creating an environment within which that happens. They have done a variety of works where they are using bacteria. They have done an interesting project where they're looking at a particular kind of a problem that a ear infection that happens pretty commonly among kids in Indonesia, and they basically worked with a lab at the university, at the Gajah Mada University, on developing different systems for getting people to change their behaviors. It's got to do with just environmental behaviors, and so they worked with the biologists, with the environmental scientists to develop systems for communicating information to people about how they can better avert these problems. But they also did installations where they tried to show what happens to these bacteria when they are growing. So it's fascinating what they were trying to do each time, and each time they were furthering a particular social agenda. Now, so I wanted to just end out by saying that the one of the big challenges I can see this each year when I see what my colleagues in Southeast Asia are doing in media arts. The larger imperative is still homogenization. Globalization, whether by technology or by cultural habits, is still very much homogenization. And what I was trying to point to you in all the works before is the kind of cultural locatedness and peculiarity of what they are doing to those places. That is under threat. That is something that is that many artists are aware about, but many don't even think about these things. And I think that the vibrancy of the kind of work they are doing can only survive if they become vigilant to the fact that technology comes, adoption of particular technology, so adoption of particular ways of using technologies are not necessarily culturally neutral. They are going to, slowly change the way they culturally relate to certain things. And that is something I think that we need to be aware about. We need to be encouraging people who are in these kinds of fields to continue to address in their own work. So that's it for me. I am sorry that I tried to finish earlier, but it was too much of slides, I think. Okay, thank you.